Well, good morning, everyone. Today I am going to talk about the Genesis 2 commentary that I have written. In this chapter, there is a lot that could be talked about, but I ended up kind of talking mostly about, well, entirely about work and really looking at the significance of God in his working and his resting, and just some of the things that maybe isn't exactly what's said in this exact chapter, but it is what is said throughout the scriptures. And I'm talking about just work as a general sort of overhead topic. So the first thing I talk about is meaningful work. I think that something I really notice about my generation, I think every generation, really has this hunger for meaningful work, that we want our work to matter. And often work is made very bitter for us because it's just a necessity, it's just an obligation, and there's not a meaningfulness to it. And I think that's something that even, companies go wrong in, where there's not really a reason for a personal investment in the work that people are doing. So it's just, clock it in, clock it out type of thing. But I talk about how we go about trying to have a meaningful work in ways of our own understanding. And I think a lot of the ways that, our society goes about this is we have that narrative of, follow your dreams, live for your dreams, people trying to have some major success or major fame, and feeling like kind of ultimately that self-satisfaction is the way to have a meaningful work. I mean, that is really a very strong narrative in our society. But the problem with that narrative is that we then kind of see all practical work, all real work, as real work. People are like, that is real work. Okay. But we see all practical work, like someone being a dentist, or, someone taking care of children, or those types of jobs. We see those as meaningless, and we end up trying to, delegate those things to other people. And we don't see work rightly, and we have sort of this contempt of, normal work. And I think that we as Christians are not exempt from this issue, and we can follow the very same sort of mentality in our religion, in our Christianity, of instead of it being, oh, I'm gonna, be a movie star, it's like, I'm gonna pursue having this famous ministry or these types of things. And again, delegating these normal, works to other people and having a contempt for those things. And that's a very common error that so many have walked in, where they try and, try and say, oh, people who were Black and enslaved in this country, oh, it was their job to do those things, or, it's women's job to do those things. And there's so much of that hatred and pride because of this pursuing a wrong meaningfulness in work. Whereas what God is showing us is to pursue meaningfulness in our work through a pursuit of godliness, through a pursuit of doing true good. And I talk about how, we really have to give up this pursuit of this wrong attitude about meaningfulness in work in order to pursue that lowly yet truly meaningful work, which is done unto God, which is done in humility and in true goodwill. And this being what we're aiming after. The purpose of what we want to be aiming at in work is true goodness. It's a love of righteousness. And when we as Christians are not learning to rightly value righteousness and godliness, then we are missing how to have a true meaningful work, because it's in love for those things. And then you find where those things are able to be had in so many different places. It's in love for those things that we find a true meaningfulness in our work and how we live. I also talk about how so much of what goes wrong in the church today is so many people think that they're serving God, because we talk about, oh, have a meaning, don't waste your life, have a meaningful purpose. but we don't catch the spirit that people can walk in those things, and how easily we can just fall into that pride, that worldly meaningfulness, just putting it into religion. And so many people, are like, okay, yeah, so live for God, that's a meaningful existence, and they run in that, and they're convinced that they're living for God, but really they're just living for themselves in their religion, in their ministry. And there's just this constant undercurrent of pride and selfish ambition, which is always going to hinder true unity and true love that the scriptures are calling us to. It's contrary to what is good and right. And so we have to see that conceit. We have to see that wrong meaningfulness that is of the world, and put those things off in order to walk in a true righteousness, a true righteous work. In Philippians 2, he says, "Fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition and conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Let each of you look not only for his own interests, but also for the interest of others." In the church today, we have so much that goes on where we act like we're pursuing this unity, we're pursuing this love, but really what it is so often people who are pursuing that selfish ambition and that conceit, trying to say that others are the ones resisting that unity, when it's their selfish ambition and conceit that is destroying that unity of mind. Because all of us are meant to be in this same work, this same meaningful work. And one of the things that I'm talking about in this chapter is how, people boast of not coveting gold and not coveting luxury, but they covet the far greater riches of the things of God. They covet a meaningful life, a meaningful existence. They covet meaningfulness in work. And they act like they've done nothing wrong when they greatly wrong their neighbor, because that is contrary to love, where you pursue that meaningfulness for yourself at the cost of the person next to you. That's what covetousness is. Covetousness is seeking your own advantage at the cost of your neighbor. And I can think of so many examples of where, these men of God stand up and they're pursuing this meaningful existence and living for God, but they have coveted those things at the very great cost of their own wives. Their wives are starved spiritually, and they're immature and they're lacking. And it's from that covetousness, it's from that conceit. And so many deny where that selfish ambition and conceit is what people are trusting in. And that's of the world. That's what meaningful work is in the world. It's trusting in selfish ambition. It's trusting in a pursuit of conceit. And we have to be very careful when we're talking about a meaningful work to understand how that comes into our religion, how that is absolutely going on in the church. And we need to see what is true meaningful work outside of that sin, because that sin, that selfish ambition and conceit, that is what is guilty for causing disunity. That's what's guilty for going contrary to love. And it's not enough to say, oh, well, we should be unified, we should be loving, when you're doing the very things that are contrary to those things. You're the one who's guilty. You're the one who's going against love and true godliness. So instead, we come to see from God, him displaying that work should be meaningful. And this is something that we need. This is something that's so much of society, I think, is crying out for, is how do I live a meaningful existence? And we're taught, this idea, this idea of self-seeking, this selfish ambition. We're taught an idea of conceit. We're taught, live unto yourself, basically, and that's meaningful. And we're not taught that the way to a meaningful existence is righteousness and godliness, that to live in a way of truly seeking what is righteous and good, and truly seeking to do for God what we can in true love to him, is a meaningful existence. But again, we have to be a bit careful with this, because there are so many people running around working for God, and they don't see how they have not been renewed within, and so therefore their work for God can be in vain. It's not just slapping on, I'm doing some work for God. It's becoming holy. It's becoming renewed in the image of Christ and having a real knowledge of God, a true knowledge of God, and serving him in that. Because so many people seek to go about serving God who don't really, truly, deeply know God. They just regurgitate what they've been told, and they haven't even tested if that's even true. That, the wisdom of man is not the same as the word of God and what he's truly saying. So again, it's not just working for God. It is working for God. It is living for God, but we have to really understand what that means and recognize the ways of things that come in that are far lower than what that actual call and meaningfulness is, and achieving that in our lives. And that's what we want to be aiming for. So what I talk about in this chapter is the true work, how working for God has to be matched with the true work of substance, that we have to have a substance within us in order to be doing the work of God. We are called to be light and salt, but that is not an automatic thing. If we are not truly working to cultivate those things within us, then we're not going to be light and salt. And I think one of the hard things that we have to face as a church is where we run out and we call ourselves light and salt, but it's evident that substance is not really in us. It is made available to us in Christ, but you have to seek those things in such an honest and sincere way in order to have them. And this is what Jesus died for. He died so that we would be redeemed from all these vain ways and these foolish ideas and all these other ways of living, to come into a true substance of righteousness, a true substance that is actually good and wise. And that's what we see displayed in God here in Genesis. He does this great work, and it's not an idea. It's not a pretense. It's an actual substance. It's an actual purity and goodness. It's actual life. And this is what we should see spiritually of what we have to aim at is a real work, a reality of righteousness, a reality of godliness. Because so many people, they go about godliness in a way that is just what's popular and common in Christian culture today, where it's, I believe these doctrines and I sign my name here and I make sure to say these things before I talk about God. I'm a sinner saved by grace, and it's all of these technicalities that they're touching on, but it's not growing past those things. It's not growing past the faith of others and developing their own faith and developing their real pursuit of God themselves, and going against what's not actually of God, what is merely the traditions and the doctrines of men, and going out to truly seek to understand and serve God himself. And so it's very easy for us to say, a meaningful existence, live for God, okay, and then you just run off in man's wisdom about what it means to live for God, and you serve that and you live for that and you do everything for that instead of truly serving what is God. I was thinking today about how bearing the cross means truly standing with Jesus and working with Jesus in all that is contrary to him. And there's such a mentality today where people are like, I'm taking a stand for God and standing against, the liberals, and, I'm taking a stand for these things. And they act like this is courageous, but they don't stand against the things in the church that are contrary to God. Not really. They don't stand against these things, and they don't even learn that they're wrong and that they're contrary to the will of God because they're so adamantly defending them. And true bravery is facing whatever is contrary to God in ourselves and all around us. And to bear the cross, to have true bravery, is to go against those things, to truly follow Christ. We have to be truly following Christ. And we have to be careful to define what that is. That's the meaningful existence. The meaningful existence is to follow Christ, but it's not these cheap ways that so many Christians live, where they have a Christianity, they have a faith, I'm not denying them that, but it's not really bearing the cost. It's not really going outside the camp and bearing the reproach of Christ and truly seeking to know him and serve him. It's just serving Christian ideas about God. And that is a same vanity as worldliness. We just don't see it because it's empty. It's vain. It's even harmful and poisonous. And how tragic to be captured by the devil to do his will in an idea of religion, and yet that's so common. So it's coming out of all of those things, and the true work that we have to do is to truly be changed and be saved from those things, from those ideas, as well as worldly ideas outside of the church, worldly ideas within the church, ideas that are of the flesh, of man's understanding and thinking, rather than what's truly of the Spirit of Christ. That is what God promises us. And for all of us, that is what Jesus died for. Jesus died so that we would come into a real righteousness. I was just reading again in Philippians and of Paul, where he's talking about how he's, counted as loss all of these things. And what is he counting as loss? He's counting as loss the things that his system and culture, his religious circle, has made them feel like they're superior, made them feel like they are good and they don't have to correct anything in themselves. And he's counted all of those things as loss for the sake of knowing Christ and coming into a real righteousness in Jesus. And I was just thinking about how much this is the issue in the church today, is how we don't lose that sense of, oh, I know what's true and I understand and I'm good, and I have faith and I'm good, and I'm, that self-contentedness in our own righteousness, rather than truly seeking to follow Jesus fully. And this is what Jesus died for. Paul talks about, not that I have perfected these things, but I lay hold of Christ for the reason that he laid hold of me. He laid hold of us so that we would walk in a true meaningful existence, a true holiness. And all of these things that are happening in the church fall short of that. They are not that. We have to go beyond those things so that we truly are following Jesus. And that is the meaningful existence. That's the way of something of real significance and living. And all these other ways of conceit or self-righteousness, all these other things of, oh, I understand and I'm good with God and da-da-da-da, those fall far short of what it truly means to do the true work and to truly follow Christ. So one of the other things I talk about surrounding work is understanding God's work versus our work. You can see in Genesis 2 where God very clearly talks about, his work, and he's, ending his work, but he's talking about how man has not been put into the garden, and man doesn't exist yet to work and cultivate the garden. So God is watering the garden in this way because man is not there to cultivate and work it. And this is just such a clear spiritual picture to the distinction between God's work and our work. And this is something so important for us to understand and respect, is how we have our own work to do, how God does his work, and our work is never superseding God's work. We're not trying to be sovereign, but there's so much that goes on in the church today of this idea that because God is sovereign, it just means that it's just God who's working, it's just God's sovereignty, and kind of believing that we're just on this automatic, current in some river carrying us perfectly to be in God's will, perfectly to be doing, what is good and right in God's eyes, perfectly, on our way to heaven, all these other things, as if we're like on an automatic track of blessing. And it really misses this great place of our responsibility, our work, and that if we do not do our work, those outcomes are not ours. That is such a very real warning in scripture that's given over and over again. And yet there's such doctrines that go out in the church in the name of God's sovereignty that deny this, that deny that we are accountable for what we choose. We are accountable for the choices that we make, and truly cultivating this righteous living with God. And that we will not grow in grace. We will not grow in holiness. We will not grow in worthiness if we're not truly daily putting our hands, to the plow, putting our hands, to the garden of our lives and working those things in them. It's just the same as any job a person would have. I've been gardening this last summer. If I don't go out there and till the ground, I don't go out there and plant seeds, I don't go out there and water everything and weed and harvest, I'm not going to have that produce. I'm not going to have that return for the work that I'm doing. And certainly it's God who gives sunshine. It's God who has this nutrients in the soil. It's God who gives the growth. But if I don't plant and I don't water, then there won't be any growth. And the relationship of these two things, of God's work and our work, is a very important thing to respect. It's a very important thing that we can get very wrong. And, the world doesn't believe in God's sovereignty. Okay. But the church doesn't believe in our human responsibility. And that's just as bad. That's horrible. That's creating some of the most wicked outcomes inside of the church. That's making the church become evil rather than light and good. And it's because really this denial of our own accountability and our own work that we are responsible to be doing. It's really important for us to see that all of us are the outcome of our own choices. God says very clearly in his word that he will judge all of us according to what we do in this life, our deeds. And all of us are living in a way that is manifesting the truth about us. And all of our works, whatever they be, is a manifestation of who we are, what we believe, what we value, what we've really given ourselves to. And we either are cultivating what is good and righteous, what is a true godliness, or we're cultivating just the sinful outcomes of our own heart and our own lives. And God shows so clearly that there's, while God is sovereign and we live by his power and his grace, it's kind of like the manna, where God puts out all this manna and there's all this manna on the ground, but if the people don't go out and gather it, then they're not going to have it. They're not going to eat it. And that's the same thing that we need to recognize as Christians, is if we're not truly going out and every day gathering the manna of God and doing the good works of God, then we can't be expecting the good blessing and outcome from God. And this is one of the great wrong beliefs in the church today, is where we believe that we have the blessing of God without doing the works of God, without doing the will of God. And this is such a powerful deception that goes on, is called pure doctrine in the church today, where it's an absolute denial of our responsibility as Christians, and that we as Christians can absolutely 100% go wrong, and that we go wrong by making wrong choices. There's this belief that the sovereignty of God means that I'm just on this automatic track of good and right. And it does not see then how every single day I'm making choices. Every single day, I'm choosing what to believe about God. I'm choosing to believe that about God. I'm choosing how to live my life. I'm choosing how much to value God every day. I'm choosing, how to treat people around me. I'm choosing whether I'm going to live selfish conceit in my heart and serve that, or whether I'm going to allow God to work in my life to show me that sin. All these different things are going on in us. And it's this belief that the good things of God, the true blessings of God, are just automatically mine, without an acknowledgement of how all of those things are only mine as much as I am worthy of them, as much as I truly work for those things. What I mean by this is that a wrong belief in God's sovereignty means that we believe that we are blessed as having done the will of God, despite whether we've done the will of God. That we're believing that we have the promises of God, despite whether we've lived righteously and worthy. We believe that we have heaven, despite whether we've lived righteously and worthy of heaven. And we don't see, that like sufferings or all these things can come into our lives just because of the choices that we've made. It's not just, God doing some particular thing and believing, oh, it's just some good from God. It's recognizing, oh, this might be a outcome of my sin. This might be an outcome of this, or, whatever. And that human choices exist within God's world. And that all of us, we have to choose every day to rightly follow God, to cultivate those things in our lives if we want to expect the promises of God, of that good outcome to be ours. There's so much that goes on in the scriptures where, Jesus talks about, all these people are going to say, oh Lord, we lived for you. We did these works for you. But he talks about how you never did the will of my Father who is in heaven. And this is the problem, is that we think that we aren't accountable to that. We don't think that we can either choose to do that or not do that. And we want to believe that we live in the blessing of being under God's will without the responsibility of if we're truly doing God's will or not. And that the blessing of conscience, the blessing of that peace of being in God's will is for those who are truly doing God's will. Instead, we have doctrines today that are about silencing the conscience that is trying to rebuke you and show you that you're wrong, that you're not doing these things. Oh no, call it grace, and put that conscience aside, sear your conscience, and don't listen to where God might be trying to wake you up and warn you. And it's all rooted in this denial of our own responsibility, because I think people are terrified of their own responsibility and they don't know how to handle it. So they think it's grace from God for him to remove responsibility from us rather than to make a way possible for us to live that out in Jesus. They say that, Jesus just gives us righteousness, just calls us good, just calls us right, instead of being the means by which to make us truly good and make us truly righteous, and that we are either working after the true righteousness within Christ or we're not. And it's all rooted in this denial of our own responsibilities. This, personal responsibility is something that can scare us, but we should recognize that it's actually one of the greatest gifts that God's given to us. It's this power in our own lives. We get to choose how to live. We get to choose what to believe. We get to choose God. We get to choose to live a meaningful life. And yes, there is the danger of choosing sin and choosing wrongly and neglecting these things. But God is not just, this is where God's sovereignty comes in, because God has not just left us as a complete loss to our own choices and that's it. No, God is here. He's with us to help us. But if we completely deny our own responsibility and our own choices and our own work, then we are going to completely miss the whole cultivation of what God is after. The reason for which Christ has laid hold of us is to work these things in us. And his grace to us is to give us the true path of life, the true meaning, a true goodness, a true good work in life. And it's so horrible to miss that, to think that grace is a removal of that rather than giving those things. One of the great verses, section of scripture that reveals this is in Titus 2, starting in verse 11. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for a blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. There is our work, and we can either live it and do it or we deny it. This is what the warning we have in Israel, all of Israel. This is one of the great warnings that we see, is there's no favoritism with God. That God judged Israel because they failed his purpose. They failed to become a righteous people. That was the entire point of his salvation of Israel. And they refused that. They were selfish and lazy, and they never walked in the things that God had redeemed them for. And it's the very same warning that all of us have as Christians, is that we have Jesus and he died for us for this purpose. And we can trample underfoot the blood of Christ. And then we're condemned. We will be condemned if we refuse the true purpose of God, the true work of God that he's given to us. One of the other things that I think we see pretty clearly here is the relationship that God shows between work and rest. I think work and rest is such an important conversation for us today, because I think in the church we do really idolize work. And we have such an emphasis in our society on productivity, that work and rest can be despised. That rest can be seen as laziness, as selfishness, or all these other things. And there's a really strong asceticism that has gone on throughout the church for a very long time that really denies us the right to kind of anything, and where we have put selfishness in the completely wrong place, where selfishness is being put in having any pleasures, having any rest, having any enjoyment. And there's such a spiritual pressure in that place where people are being driven in the name of loving God and serving God to these very harsh extremes. And the thing with all of that is that that's just going to embitter people against God or make them sick, literally get people killed for breaking their health because they just drive themselves. And they are constantly representing God as a hard master, that he doesn't give us rest, he doesn't give us things to enjoy, and that everything in life is just sinful and worldly, all these things that go on. And I think one of the things we really need to fight spiritually is for this right relationship, where we're not neglecting our work, where we're not being idle, where we're not just sitting back and drifting on clouds and, being kind of worthless in this world, but at the same time, balancing that very carefully with a right godly rest and learning what that even means, learning what that looks like. Because I think a lot of times people think, I'm going to, have a meaningful existence for God. I'm going to, live in displaying for God by doing a ton of work and living in this activity, this productivity. And we have to recognize that is the mindset of the world still. That's not God's mindset. That's our mindset of meaningfulness. That's our mindset coming from our society, which is really seeing productivity as power. Because we talk so much about laziness and idleness, and sure, that's a thing, but in our society, there's plenty of people who know nothing about God, who are, those people waking up I wake up at 5 a.m. and I go and do this and I do that. And there's so many Christians who are enamored with that lifestyle and are pursuing that as meaningfulness. And we have to be really careful that that's not what we're following, that we are learning right rest and we are not pursuing that kind of conceit as if that's our power, because that's really what the worldly heart does, is it's seeking that edge over others, and that edge over others is what we feel is powerful, we feel is leading us to that meaningful life. So people are always having to push it back. Now I wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm doing better, and it's that pursuit of that edge, and we have to be really careful to learn humility away from that conceit, as if that's the promise, as if that's the power, whereas living righteously and truly following Jesus is the power of life. And that humility should teach us a right rest, how to be humble enough to rest. Think about the people who can't, work all these hours. Think about the people who you are putting contempt upon and elevating yourself over in your ambition, your selfish ambition, and your conceit. You know, it's very important to rightly understand rest, and to be humble even in rest. I mean, we talk about idleness and laziness and, you know, all these things, but what was the commandment that God gave to Israel that they constantly were violating? His Sabbath. You know, they were constantly working when they shouldn't have been working. They should have been resting, and they should have been, you know, honoring the Lord in those things. So, you know, that speaks to us too, is a right godly rest and an understanding of true rest, but not in this idle selfishness that so many people fall into. Of, you know, I've seen so many Christians that they don't do the work, and it's all about, you know, I'm drifting on a cloud, you know, and all these things are great for me, and la 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 la, and they're just completely not doing the work at all. But to be doing the true work is not the same as productivity, and it's not the same as asceticism and denying, you know, yourself all these pleasures in life because you're so superior, and you're having a trust in this kind of system of righteousness, this false righteousness over others, rather than giving those things up, as Paul is talking about in Philippians, and truly living out the true righteousness of humbly serving Jesus and living after righteousness, which is not going to have that superiority. It's not going to have that great shining superiority to show off to others. Oh, I wake up at 3 a.m. or whatever. It's not going to have those things. It's going to be modest. It's going to be just doing the humble good work, and that's very hard for our flesh. So the last thing I talk about is, you know, the Sabbath that God is displaying here, the Sabbath in Genesis 2. And, you know, the great message that God is giving to us in humanity is to be worthy of the great Sabbath of God. You know, with Israel, the first generation that came out of Egypt, you know, he said of all of them except, you know, a couple, that they weren't going to enter his rest. And why? Because they were corrupt, and they were contrary to God, and they disobeyed him, and they didn't listen to him, and they were walking all these sins. And that's, God has said to us in 1 Corinthians 10, you know, he's telling us that is a great example for us as Christians to recognize that we can fall into the very same condemnation as them. You know, God saved them. He took them out of Egypt, but then they died in the wilderness. And this is the warning for Christians, is God has saved us. Rejoice. We're brought out of Egypt, but God didn't just bring us out of Egypt and throw us into the promised land. There's the wilderness in between. And the wilderness is where God begins to teach the people his ways, teach them to obey him, teach them to know him. And the test is whether we're going to do that or not. And all of us, what God is calling us to is to be worthy of the true rest by doing the true work. That there is a rest for the people of God who truly labor for righteousness and godliness, and not just out, you know, externally yelling at people and, you know, doing this busyness without, but the true work within, the true work of learning God and truly humbly listening to his word, listening to his spirit, and learning how to genuinely walk with him. God is giving us hope, incredible hope, that there's a meaningful work to be done, and there's a meaningful rest to be had. But all of these things, they have to be done in obedience. They have to be done by a right sincerity, a right respect to God, a right respect for how we walk in this life, and a right responsibility, taking those things on us. And all of us want to be very careful to be worthy of that rest. That is what God is promising us, that there is a true rest for those who do the true work. Yeah.